Right, we'll start in about, very soon, I guess.
Fairly soon. Site specific.
When everyone's sat down.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Peter Cruikshank. I'm a lecturer here at Napier University. I am chairing this morning's sessions, and I have great pleasure in introducing Laura Irvine, who will talk about ad tech and transparency in the context of GDPR, which I'll just step back and let her do it.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for making the journey to this beautiful venue. I've heard people speak in this room before, but I've never had the opportunity to speak myself, so I'm very excited about this, and also very excited about this topic. So it's not really hugely about security, but it is about big data, so I figured I could squeeze the topic into this conference. Thank you to Basil for inviting me to speak in this lovely room. So, ad tech is something that I think we're all very, very aware of at the moment. I think it's something that's crept into our lives without us realising exactly what's going on. And that's kind of the theme of my talk. So one of the things that the GDPR brought in last year was a new obligation in relation to transparency. So we need to tell people what we're doing with their data. And that can be a challenge in certain sectors. And specifically, I think, in the ad tech sector, that's something that has not been bottomed out yet and that is not being done correctly. And that leads on to problems when we require consent to process that kind of data. And particularly in the advertising sector, it is a significant challenge because often the legal basis for processing data has to be consent. In the context of other uses of big data, I see the ad tech industry damaging the prospects of the use of big data because we all, as data subjects, as individuals, may become a little bit more nervous about giving certain personal data to apps and to putting our personal data online in certain circumstances, because if we don't know what's happening to it, and if we lose that control, which is something that's very, very important in terms of our personal data, then we might be more reluctant to share data, not in an advertising context, but perhaps in a health context. And we all know that Napier does a huge amount of work in that sector to try and improve the health service and the solutions that it provides. But if individuals are nervous about providing data in an online or app context, then I think that could be detrimental to us as a society. So, I think the ad tech industry has a big part to play there in making us as individuals comfortable doing that, remaining in control, and then big data can be used for much more positive reasons rather than advertising. But I think advertising has a big part to play in making us feel comfortable. So that's the kind of thesis of what I want to say today. I will talk a little bit and put that in context in terms of a recent BBC article that I came across, which demonstrates perhaps some of the dangers and perhaps some of the worries and concerns that we as individuals might have about putting data online. And I think it's quite a good little article. It's quite easy to understand and to follow, but it looks at some of the issues about preferences that perhaps online are inferred about us and how they can be quite wrong, and then if we look at how that's used, it can be rather disturbing. And that leads us on to the ethical issues about what should and shouldn't be captured online. I also want to talk about some of the enforcement action that's taken place under the GDPR. Some of it's under the old data protection regime, but I think there's themes coming out there, and particularly in the context of large technology companies, and we're going to talk about Facebook, we're going to talk about Google, and other online marketing platforms where the regulators in Europe and beyond have taken action against all of these organisations, which to some extent have been left to get on with it until now, and perhaps the GDPR has given organisations who regulate in this sector a little bit more power to impose sanctions on these large technology companies that will actually have an impact. And so we'll look at some of those fines, why they were imposed, and what might happen going forward, and the lessons to be learned from them. I might talk about the e-privacy regulation, which is a new piece of law that's coming through, and which will regulate this sector, the advertising sector, a lot more closely and in a much more broader context, taking into account technological advancements, which will impact Facebook and Google and how they use all of that technology. So let us move on to this BBC article. So it's worth having a look at. It's very short, and it will not teach you anything you don't already know, and particularly the people in this room, I imagine, are pretty well informed about this stuff. But I think what it helped me to think about was how people are looking in general at what's going on online and the concerns that we might have. So the author of this article was, I can't remember his name, he's a BBC journalist, and his interest was sparked initially by the IT Hoover that he has, which goes around his house, mapping out his house. And those maps of his house are then sent to a server in China and stored there. So it just started him thinking about all these IoT devices and other online areas where he has put personal data in, or where personal data about him is used. And what he did was made 80 subject access requests to different organisations that he'd had contact with, some that he hadn't had contact with, and that he found through making these subject access requests. And he gathered together lots of information that these organisations had about him. Now, he created this term, and I really like it, the data doppelganger. So his online persona was created by all of this personal data that was held by these organisations. And of course, they often share data and combine that data to produce an online personality for this individual, and that is drawn not necessarily from facts, but from information that can be inferred from stuff he's clicked on online, or stuff he has liked or simply interacted with online. And so there was a whole list of characteristics that he could look at that from gaining this information through making subject access requests. Some of it was contrasting interests that he allegedly had. Some of it was actually what we call special category data. So in his case, religious information, political preference, health information. That kind of inference about his personality has been made by some of these organisations who he's categorised in that way. At one point, he also discovered that he was categorised as a woman who was trying to conceive. Interesting, but we can see not only is there information that confusing the information that is obviously wrong, but these are profiles that are created about him. And I think it's interesting to see just all of these influences, all of these preferences set out in that article in quite a simple way. But what we then need to go on to understand is how they are used. That, by the way, is my data doppelganger, which my son created using my mobile phone. And it started me thinking, maybe my 8-year-old son's knowledge about me, my personality, my characteristics is less accurate than Google and Facebook. I don't know, I'll just leave you with that. But that's my data doppelganger. So, what is it that we need to think about in terms of GDPR compliance? I'll move on to that one and we'll come back. In the ad tech industry, you will all be aware that there's lots of different companies involved in delivering targeted advertising to us. Now, this is I don't even know what to call it, a graph, a pictorial representation of the different organisations and the different characters that are involved in the ad tech industry. And there's lots of different ways that all the data comes together, is aggregated, and then this real-time bidding that takes place so that companies can place adverts in front number of organisations within that graph who get personal data. And there's queries about whether it is actually personal data. Sometimes I've spoken to organisations and they reassure me they have no personal data, it's all hashed. And in fact, I was at a talk in the Google garage, at the West End, which was all about this kind of stuff, and the man from Google claimed that they didn't have personal data because it was all hashed. Now that's not the case. They do have lots of personal data, and maybe it's hashed somewhere, but they can stick that back together again, and that very, very clearly is personal data. So there's lots of questions about that. There is also a query about whether or not inferred characteristics are personal data. My belief is that they are, because they are being used in a way that impacts on us as individuals. Perhaps that's by us being targeted by adverts, but also we have seen with the Facebook Cambridge Analytica stuff that perhaps it also is used to influence our political opinions. And that's where this kind of inferred characteristics and inferred preferences become a little bit more disturbing. Delivering adverts, I think we can cope with in general. Even my mum understands that when she looks at a pair of shoes online, she will get an advert on Facebook, and at first she was a wee bit worried about that, but she's okay with it now. Advertising is one thing, political influencing is very different. And when we come back to the characteristics of the individual from the BBC article, some of those were blatantly wrong. And therefore, that can be also quite disturbing to think that our societies are being influenced in that way. One of the other issues that's talked about in this arena, and particularly in advertising, is the ethical use of this data. So there are many, many characteristics that can be pointed to online which demonstrate, for example, that someone who suffers from manic depression is heading into a manic phase. When someone has a manic phase, they are more likely to spend money. This is part of the pathology of the disease. And therefore, it could lead advertisers, marketing organisations, to target that individual in a particular way. Oh, we know that you're likely to spend more money. Here's an advert about a holiday in Barbados that we think you will buy. That, I think we would all agree, is not an ethical use of data, but it's something that perhaps is happening. And one of the things that this graph demonstrates is that there's a lot of organisations in that greyed out section that are kind of hidden. So we know about Facebook, we know about Google, but there's lots of organisations in there that operate in this sphere, and we don't know clearly about them. So, coming back to the previous slide then, the transparency obligation under the GDPR, we have to tell people what we are doing with their data. And that is the definition from the Act. It has to be done in a concise, transparent, intelligible, and easily accessible form using plain and clear language. And the challenge is telling people in a clear, transparent, easy to understand way what's happening to their data in the context of ad tech. So, lots of sharing of data, lots of technical use of data, hashing, yes, maybe it becomes anonymised at one point, but the data's out there, and how is it being used? And the industry, the ad tech industry's challenge now is making that clear to us as consumers, as users of services, what is happening, how is my data being used, and am I comfortable with that? And do you know what? Many people are comfortable with receiving targeted advertising because they want to have adverts delivered to them of stuff they are interested in. And there's lots of surveys done where people are comfortable with that, but they need to understand how it's happening, they need to understand what their data is being used for, and there needs to be a moral and ethical boundary there so that issues like the one I described about manic depressive states are not used in an unethical way by marketers. And so that, for me, is a really big challenge in this sector, and particularly when often these organisations are seeking consent from us as their legal basis to process data, because in the marketing sphere that is often necessary. We need to know what we are providing consent to. So some of the cases that I'm just going on to talk about demonstrate that that consent that organisations are seeking is not detailed enough. It's not clear enough what we're consenting to, therefore it's not valid consent, and that's where the big fines are coming in. So we'll talk about the big ad tech companies. So we all know Facebook's free to use, but that's because our data is valuable to Facebook, and particularly in the marketing sphere. So the ICO fined Facebook last year. Biggest fine that they have ever issued, £500,000. Now that was under the old regime, and of course the ICO were criticised for the small sum of money for an organisation like Facebook, who earns a lot more than that on a daily basis, but they did use their maximum fining powers, and it was all about the fairness of the processing of data. So we give Facebook data, they were passing it, or allowing app developers to access all of that data, not only about Facebook users, but about the friends of Facebook users who simply hadn't consented in any way, shape or form to that happening. The Facebook users themselves may have consented, but it wasn't clear what they were consenting to. And interestingly, the Facebook fine also was about Facebook failing to monitor these app developers in terms of their compliance with the contract that they had with them. So the contract said, app developers, you can use the data for these purposes, but they were using that data for other purposes, i.e. selling it on to companies like Cambridge Analytica, who were then using it in slightly more disturbing ways to influence our political decisions. So that was why Facebook were fined by the ICO. So fairness and consent, and a failure to monitor. And that fine is in the context, I think, of the political use of the data. Not so much advertising, but political use of the data. And I think that's where we're becoming slightly more concerned about how these companies are using our data. Facebook is also facing regulatory action in the United States. And this is quite a big step for regulators there. So the FTC is the regulator in this sector. Personal data in the United States is regulated from a consumer standpoint. The right to privacy isn't quite as strong there, but it's all about consumers and their protection. So that's why the FTC is involved. And in 2011, Facebook signed an undertaking with the FTC, the Privacy Consent Decree, which said that it would not misrepresent the use of private data. And for a long, long time, privacy campaigning organisations have been trying to encourage the FTC to actually enforce this decree. And recently it was announced that they would do that. And the fine that is being banded around, the level of fine is $5 million. So it's a significantly higher fine than $500,000 that the ICO was able to impose. And I think that, again, is a step towards not just allowing Facebook to get on with it, but thinking about controlling what it's doing and making sure that we are protected as consumers. So, interesting that Facebook is being challenged. And similarly, we've seen Google being challenged as well. So this is a GDPR fine. The French regulator, CNIL, fined Google, highest fine under the GDPR to date, €50 million. And that was all about transparency failings. So Google has, and you may or may not have dug into your Google profile. It takes a long time to try and work out where all your preferences are held. And there are lots and lots of consents built into the Google model. So CNIL was concerned about how difficult it was to find that information. And you will find guidance from the European Data Protection Body, which is now the sort of overarching body within the EU that tells us how to interpret the GDPR. you should never bury that information more than 2 taps away. Now, that will be challenging for these large organisations which have lots and lots of data processing going on. But very clearly, CNAIL found that Google did not comply with that, and it was very difficult to find the information about what Google was doing with our data. There were also pre-ticked boxes effectively built into the model, so there was no valid consent to the processing as well. So that fine will be, we understand, will be appealed, but there'll be lots of kind of learning from how CNAIL feel the GDPR should be interpreted in relation to transparency and consent. And it's going to be a very interesting time for these large organisations, large ad tech organisations in particular, to work out if their model does comply with the GDPR or not. And they do try and increase transparency, and you will see that on all the online platforms. But it's a challenge in the context of that very complex ad tech methodology. There is also another privacy rights campaigning organisation called Brave. So they have a web browser that you can download that has privacy built into it, but they have also raised complaints with various regulators in the EU, and recently the Irish regulator announced that it was going to be looking into Google, and in particular that real-time bidding double-click technology that the graph demonstrated. And that, their complaint there is about all this sharing of data with all of these organisations on an hourly basis. There's thousands of organisations are getting this data, and that does include special category data, so the more sensitive kind of information. And that, again, the investigation is ongoing. It will take a long time and it will be complicated, but again, it will highlight the issues that we all deserve to understand as users of this technology, and encourage that transparent approach that will be challenging, but that is necessary to take this forward. Just another note about this organisation. Vectory was an app developer. So there was 4 different organisations that CNAIL, again in France, looked into, but Vectory was the developer of the technology. So it used an app which tracked individuals' locations, which you will all know is very easy to do when you're using mobile phone technology. The privacy notice, the transparency information, again, was not clear enough. It was very complicated, and users were not aware that actually they were being tracked. Their geolocation data was being used in the particular way that it was. So, yes, we were told, but we needed more information about what was happening. And particularly in this case, it was the sharing of data with other organisations, that loss of control of the personal data that CNAIL was very exercised by. And still pre-ticked boxes where the organisation believed that was consent, which we all know under the GDPR is not consent. So you can see the themes coming through here, lots of transparency, still misunderstandings about consent, and all of these organisations must get better at telling us what is happening so that we are comfortable giving that consent, and that consent is valid. So there's my conclusions for today's presentation. Can the ad tech industry capture big data whilst explaining to us effectively and properly what is actually going on? They need to get better at that. They need to be clearer about that. And one of the things I always talk about when I'm talking about transparency, if you are writing your privacy notice and you're establishing what should go in it, you're understanding what's happening with the personal data you're processing, and you're a wee bit uncomfortable about telling users what is going on with their data, and that probably suggests that it's not fair processing. And these are the thought processes that the GDPR encouraged us to do, and that's why it was a very effective exercise to create your privacy notice. And I'm sure the lawyers in Google had a fantastic time creating their GDPR privacy notice, and that's obviously still work in progress. But that is a huge obligation, transparency and then fairness, and you must be clear about that. So once we know what's happening to our data, once we understand what these large tech companies are doing, who they're sharing our data with, once we can trace that, are we happy with that? Are we happy to provide our consent to that? And that is going to be a challenge for the ad tech sector in particular. So can we make it better? Can we make it more acceptable to us as individuals? Can we get valid consent? And these are the questions to ask. But built into that as well, and you will have been, no doubt, to many different talks, and you'll have seen discussions about this, ethics and morality have to be built into what we're doing with big data online. And in my view, the ad tech industry needs to start doing that better so that we are comfortable providing that information for much more worthy, larger societal functions than just advertising. And that is me. Thanks very much.
Let's see if we can turn this thing on. Does this work? No, it doesn't.
You can speak into it.
No. Oh, yes, it is working. Brilliant. Because I was getting an online row from Bill Buchanan for not miking up the speaker. So we at least can mic up the questions. Do we have any questions? Yes.
Thank you for presentation. So my question, what to do with all the harm they are doing already all the time? Yes, so just in addition to your conclusions, yes, what to do with all the harm they are already doing, as we maybe discussed a year ago?
What will they be doing?
No, I mean, so they are doing a lot of harm, yes, to people. So like bullying, like this inciting of terrorism, for example, the 22nd of May, 2007. What can we do about the harm they already did to people and doing every day? I mean, Google and Facebook, for example.
So I think what you're asking about is this kind of online harm agenda, and the government has obviously, in the UK certainly, made announcements about trying to control how these organisations can stop that happening. And they would argue, so I will do devil's advocate, they would argue that they're just a platform where people put information and they cannot control that. But we all know that due to the size of these organisations and due to the resources that they have, actually they could do that better. It is a huge challenge. You're going to have to take that off the screen because people are squinting. It is a challenge, and I'm not underestimating that. But there just needs to be more monitoring of that online. And I think even Mark Zuckerberg has said he wants to be told to do that. He wants laws in place to make sure that they are obliged to do that. It's very difficult, and it will never be an exact science. And of course, the internet was created to be open and to allow us that freedom of expression. But there must be limits, and there are limits to that. And more work has to be done there, and more resources have to be put into it. But of course, that's a challenge for all organisations. But I think the large organisations, like the ones we've discussed today, could spend more resources on that. And perhaps they will be forced to by legislation, and perhaps that's the only way to do it.
Great. Thank you. I think this works. Yay. Do we have? Oh, we've got more questions. Oh, I'll take one more question now, and then it'll be Tim. But we'll probably have time for further discussion later on. Yeah.
Legal question. Judge Lord Sumption is doing Ruth lectures at the moment, and he's raising the issue of how much law is penetrating society more than government, and whether it's a good thing. However, in this particular case, is the law, and particularly challenging large organisations in the courts, and then getting a direction under Article 17 GDPR for deletion of data, the antidote to the models that have been perpetrated, the business models that have been perpetrated to date?
That's a really good question. So the GDPR increased the regulator's powers, and I've talked about some of the fines that have been issued. The ICO hasn't issued a fine under the GDPR yet. I was speaking with one of the ICO representatives yesterday, and she assures me it's coming, and I have no doubt that they are, and they will use the powers, but they're limited, they have limited resources. The real power under the GDPR is individuals exercising their rights. So yes, the right to erasure, which is actually quite a limited right, but in the context of, you know, that kind of online data, fascinating to see what happens. Also, your right of subject access request, and then your right to object to processing, which I think is Article 21. That's a really good one to use to raise concerns. So I have a little campaign at the moment with a bank where, when I looked at their privacy notice, they share my data with Marks and Spencer's. Now, Marks and Spencer's name is on my credit card, but Marks and Spencer's is not a financial organisation, so it's just a licensed name because we trust Marks and Spencer's. So obviously we're going to use their name, a named product, but actually there's a bank in the background. So I read the privacy notice because I'm a geek and I do that, and I found out they said they were sharing my data with Marks and Spencer's. Not just the fact I have a card, my transactional data. And it's all about profiling, it's all about Marks and Spencer's understanding what I like. I don't mind them finding out what I buy in Marks and Spencer's, but I don't want them to know everything else about me. So I made a subject access request to that bank. I had to write to them because they don't have an email address for their data protection officer, complaint number 1 when I get round to making it. And then 3 times I asked for my data, and eventually I got it. I only wanted the data about what was being shared. I didn't want everything, because I get my statements online to save trees. Now I have a paper copy of them because they gave me that in response. And I asked what data do you share? I still don't know. And that's 18 months after I made the first request. So I'm going to specifically object to the processing, the sharing of the data, and I'm going to make a complaint to the ICO about that. I'm not going to take it to court because that's super expensive. Judges and lawyers are all very expensive to use. But these campaigning organisations will be the source of that. So I think fascinating times in terms of individual rights and people exercising them. They're often very misunderstood, and the right to erasure is actually not a great one, although in a marketing context it's more effective. But yes, exercise your rights. There's my call to arms.
Okay, I think we'll have to stop there and let Tim do his talk. But we've got a discussion session anyway after Tim's one, so there'll be a chance for more questions, I think, to crop up then. There'll be a slight hiatus while I work out how to change presentations.
Oh, what does that?